Welcome, everyone, to the Congress for the New Urbanism Fireside Chats. Today, we have a very interesting new topic titled, Are the Streets of Gold Walkable? Joining us today is Eric Jacobsen. He is a reverend and senior pastor of the First Presbyterian Church in Tacoma, Washington. He's also the author of Sidewalks in the Kingdom, New Urbanism and the Christian Faith, and The Space Between, a Christian Engagement with the Built Environment. Eric will be in discussion today with President and CEO of CNU, John Norquist, who will join us now.
Hey, Tim. Thanks for the introduction. Welcome on the show, Eric.
Thank you.
We're really happy that you're there. As a minister, I think also, was your father a minister as well?
My father was involved in ministry in a parachurch organization, and my father-in-law is a minister, so surrounded by ministers.
So you got it in your family.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, I'm a PK. My father was a Presbyterian minister. He was born a Covenant, but there weren't enough Covenant churches around when he graduated from seminary, so then he became a Presbyterian. So what does religion have to do with design, neighborhoods, all that sort of thing? What got your interest in it? Why isn't your nose stuck in the Bible instead of messing around with new urbanism?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I sort of fell into it in a funny way. I had the fortunate privilege of always living in these great pre-World War II neighborhoods. You know, grew up in one, went to school in those kind of settings. And then when I first went into the ministry, lived in that kind of a setting. My church was in that kind of setting, and I just took it for granted that you could walk to church or from home or office, walk to the coffee shop and meet people for coffee. And I discovered over a variety of incidences that setting and that experience I was having was not only rare, it was becoming increasingly rare as all the new stuff being built was suburban. And so, you know, one of the examples that hit me was our local coffee shop had gone out of business. The owner had died, and the building owner wanted to lease it again to a pizza place, which would involve a zoning variance, which the neighborhood got all involved in. And I realized for the first time that some people didn't think having a coffee shop or a pizza place in the neighborhood was a good idea. They liked to separate commercial from residential. And to me, it made no sense to me. And I realized that I was in the minority there. So I got thinking about some of the policy issues behind that. I stumbled across, you know, Suburban Nation and Jane Jacobs and Kunstler and all the rest, and just drank it in and realized that this stuff really had a lot to do with some of the community building things we were trying to do as a Christian community, but the Christian community seemed unaware of that discussion.
You have say, like Palm Sunday, where you had the parade through Jerusalem, what amounted to a parade where people were cheering Jesus on, and you know, it's an important day. It's like a parade.
Right.
And then in the Catholic Church in particular, you have the Stations of the Cross.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about it in the sprawl environment with the highly separated uses and the cul-de-sacs. It would be really hard to have a parade.
Oh, absolutely.
It would be really hard to do the Stations of the Cross. I mean, it'd be really hard to cross a street, you know, if it's like 8-10 lanes running at 45-50 miles an hour, like most of the big arterial streets.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and not only some of those formal aspects, but even just sort of the informal contact. You know, I try and retell some of the stories in the Bible in a contemporary setting as a way of drawing attention to this. But I tell the story of Jesus encountering the woman who was had some kind of disorder and was bleeding, and he touched her and he healed her, and it's this really amazing story. And I retell that story in a suburban setting, where Jesus is living in a subdivision and his church is in a, mega church that's got a big parking lot, and he zooms from place to place in his SUV, and really he never sees the woman because the part of town she's living in isn't where he would be walking around. And so, it's amazing how much of the biblical stories take place in the public realm with people bumping into people, both in formal and informal settings. So it's amazing how far we've come from that, and trying to do those kinds of things in a suburban setting, I think, is really hard. I don't think I could be a pastor in the suburbs because it would be very alien to have to do everything in a car.
Well, let's approach it from a different standpoint. Churches and the property that they're on.
Yes.
It's hard for me to even remember anything in the last 20 years where a church has been built on the same block with other buildings.
Yeah.
So that, nowadays the new churches that are built on their own block, maybe more than one block. They're usually built with a giant parking lot surrounding a box with a cross on top of it. So we've gotten to the point where you can't even build a church the separate use zoning and the desire for large amounts of parking, where you can't even have a church that's part of the neighborhood physically.
Right.
This seems to be a trend that can't be very satisfying to somebody who's serious about, a neighborhood church.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great sort of topic of discussion, and it's mystified me to some extent. Those haven't been my churches so far, but I do observe those and see that trend. I'm hoping it's reversing a bit, but Pascal said something really interesting. Men never delight in doing evil so much as when they can do it for religious reasons. And I think about that as maybe somewhat offering an explanation in that I think American Christians, like Americans in general, have sort of bought into, extreme individualism, privatism, consumerism, and, those values shape those kinds of churches to some extent. And I think when churches adopt those values, they have the additional ability to put a righteous spin on it in such a way that they don't hear as quickly the critique of that, because
and then part of it is the forms that they're offered. Basically it's campus architecture. So if you look at school campuses, which schools used to be part of a block, they used to be smaller. Now you have the School Facility Planner Association wants high schools to be at least 30 acres and middle schools 20 acres and grammar schools or elementary schools 10 acres. Wrigley Field is 8.3 acres. So by their standard, a grade school should be bigger than the site that Wrigley Field is on where the Cubs play.
Right.
And those same standards tend to drip over into university and campus, church campus. The very idea of a campus for a church. I remember my dad's churches when I was a little kid, in Bloomington, Illinois, the First Presbyterian Church, which is now torn down, and they moved to a site way out on the edge of town that's, about 10 times bigger than the previous one. But the beautiful church was on a portion of one block.
Oh, yeah.
And just isn't done anymore.
Yeah. Well, I actually do think that trend is starting to soften a little bit. I think the church, the mega church on the mega site, obviously they're still being built, they're still in existence, but I do see some among even those kinds of sensibilities, a little bit of a change. You're seeing a recognition that scale is losing, intimacy, authenticity, whatever other kinds of values they might be aspiring towards. And so you see a real struggle, because I think, sympathetically, the some of what's driving that is they want the celebrity pastor, that can deliver an amazing sermon, and that draws those kinds of crowds, that kind of quality programming sometimes comes with that scale, but they lose intimacy. And so you see churches, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, but they're sensing that that scale has gotten too big. They want to be more embedded in the neighborhood, and so they're doing things like multi-site churches where, you know, you'll have a rock star pastor who can preach an amazing sermon, but they'll simulcast it in multiple locations, at smaller locations that are more embedded in the neighborhood.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well.
That's one attempt, I think, to reconcile that. I'm not sure how I feel about preaching via an electronic medium like that, but I do see that at least there's a softening of that trend, because I think being part of the neighborhood is a real.
You're from. You know, the Presbyterian Church is considered mainline Protestant church, and the mainline Protestant churches were sort of dominant in terms of market share, along with the Roman Catholics. But now the more evangelical churches, just like in South America, the evangelical churches have taken market share from the Roman Catholics. Although the biggest market share threat is probably non-believers. So there's plenty of people that don't go to anything. But anyway, one of the arguments that's made is that the mainline churches, because they're supposedly not as fervent or believe as surely and thoroughly as the evangelical churches. But in your case, from talking to you earlier, Eric, you actually are you have very fervent beliefs about God, Jesus Christ, and the heaven and hell, and all the basic things that Christians tend to believe in.
Yes.
Whereas I think you get with the evangelicals, at least with a little part of the movement, it's been that sort of urbanism is somehow evil, and that God lives better in the more suburban environment, and that somehow the city's a bad place, like Sodom and Gomorrah. I ran into that when I was mayor. I was supporting light rail, and I went to a meeting, and some evangelical Christian got up and said that light rail was the tool of the devil. And I always found that argument really puzzling. But the criticism that somehow the only way to show your true belief is to be evangelical. Just speak to that for a minute, because you really are.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a complex world out there, and so I'm in a mainline tradition. But within the mainline traditions, there's a range, and I probably fall on the more evangelical side of that range. So that's my.
Yeah, you'd have some of the Unitarian Church. Sometimes my dad used to joke that the Unitarians are so tolerant that they even allow people who believe in God to attend their services.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's definitely been, so I guess I can speak to that evangelical side of the question. That maybe makes, my contribution, interesting, if not the only religious voice out there. But, I do think, part of the problem, the theological part of the problem is, sort of, a misunderstanding or a particular take on what the Bible says about cities and those kinds of things. And actually,
the whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah, that's sometimes taken as you should get rid of the cities. I mean, I don't think Pol Pot and the Kampuchean Communist Party got that idea from Sodom and Gomorrah, but they basically leveled the cities of Cambodia. It's sort of anti-urban. That's where the intelligentsia are. The Nazis hated Berlin.
Yeah.
They got their lowest vote totals in the cities.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can't get much more evil than the Nazis.
Yeah, I think there is that tendency, but what's been interesting to me as someone who reads the Bible with a great deal of seriousness is I think it's based on some misunderstanding. I think some of that's prejudice coming from elsewhere that's read into the Bible. And the way we describe it sometimes is if you look at the whole story of the Bible, it begins in a garden and it ends in a city. And so the end of the Bible is this dramatic scene of the New Jerusalem, coming down from heaven to earth, and so it's an urban vision of heaven that is really out there. And what a lot of American Christians, especially the evangelical stripe, have done has sort of glorified Eden. Things have gotten bad, so let's return to Eden and let's blame the city. But they're not reading their Bible carefully enough, in my opinion. They don't see that the New Jerusalem is the picture there. And I love how Kunstler, picks this up. I was just reading this in City in Mind. He talks about Atlanta and how the Christians, trying to make sense of a tragic death, start describing heaven, and it's kind of this theme park heaven. It's not, and it's that
Bible land.
This Bible land. I think that does cause some evangelicals to dismiss the city and to see investment in the city and trying to make the city a better place as counterproductive. And I think that's part of maybe where that's some of my audience, is to convince those folks to maybe reconsider. I think there's a lot of great urban stuff. The other Bible text that I turn to that I think is really evocative is from the not as popular book of Zechariah, chapter 8. It says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, old men and old women shall again sit in the streets of Jerusalem, each with staff in hand because of their great age, and the streets of the city shall be full of boys and girls playing in its streets." I mean, that is a picture of, heaven in a sense, and I think it's very urban and it's beautiful, and that kind of text isn't picked up as much by that popular evangelical.
There's that quote from Matthew where, wide is the road or narrow is the road that's to heaven, and wide is the road to hell. So whenever there's a road widening project that I'm opposing it, I tend to.
I never thought of making that connection. That's great to have in my back pocket.
It's Matthew something. I'll have to look it up and send it to you.
Yeah.
Also, talking about pro-urban parts of the Bible, there's the Lamentations of the prophet Jeremiah. They're right at the beginning, the very beginning of the book of Lamentations. "How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow she has become. She that was great among nations, princess among provinces, has become tributary. She weeps bitterly in the night, tears on her cheeks. Among all her lovers she has none to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her." I thought that sort of, describes the situation for American cities in the post-World War II period.
Yeah.
There was a lot of friends of cities that were actually ripping the cities apart.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So.
And programs that did, like, urban renewal and the freeway programs and all that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Getting back to the architecture issue, the architecture of churches and lot size, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is on a tiny piece of property in the middle of Jerusalem, in the old city of Jerusalem. Or is it in Bethlehem? I'm forgetting. There's two different.
It's in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem.
Okay, that's the one I've actually. I think I've seen that site. And then there's one in Bethlehem that's also famous. It's also on a very small site.
The Church of the Nativity?
The Church of the Nativity, yeah.
Yeah.
So, in both cases, they're just a small part of otherwise bigger neighborhood, and the density and texture of the neighborhood is very fine grained.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's something we could point to and say, that churches can actually fit into neighborhoods.
Oh, absolutely. And it's again, you're seeing a little bit of a change. I'm seeing, for a while, and still happening a bit, but the classic thing you'd see in a city is a church up for sale. The congregation grayed out, and died, and then put their lot up for sale. It's going to become a condos or a dance club or something. But in the last couple of years, I'm starting to see those properties getting bought up or at least leased by churches, and oftentimes evangelical churches, to come and populate those. So I think they're looking at new models, but it's a long road to get back there. I was about 10 years ago or so, I wrote a brief article for the New Urban News, and topic was trying to see if any of the new urban projects that were out at the time, there were 600, I think, at the time. I don't know how many there are now. I could find about 10 or 12 that had a church or synagogue or something on site, and I was curious about that and had asked around what the deal was. And I found a lot of the developers of those projects were very open to having a church. In fact, they had kind of, identified a nice central location for a public building, as they said, and they were soliciting churches to build there so they could have a church in the center of their project. And they were having a hard time getting churches to buy those plots and to build there. And part of it was their mission organizations, for whatever denomination they were part of, had rules based on, suburban assumptions that you had to have a certain amount of acreage to have a successful church plan.
They adopted the same dumb rules that the school facility planners.
Absolutely, yeah. They're reading from the same playbook, and they're missing the point that there are people who live in those kinds of neighborhoods are very interested in a fine-grained. They want to do not only the orange juice test, they want to do some of them want to do the worship test. Can they send? They
forget wherever two or more gather in my name.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't remember which scripture that one was. Okay, now I have one more design question, and I'm going to ask you more about the way of life, why you like new urbanism and how you think it fits into a Christian life.
Yeah.
In defense of the more conservative churches, the Missouri Synod and Wisconsin Synod Lutheran churches, which are very conservative compared to like the ELC Lutheran Church, which is more the mainline Protestant. The Wisconsin and Missouri Synod Lutheran churches in Milwaukee have, between the two of them, 19 schools, 2 high schools and 17 grade schools that are in the city, that aren't in the suburbs, and are part of the school choice program in Milwaukee. And most of the kids that go to those Lutheran schools are black or Hispanic and come from mostly lower income families. And even before the school choice program started, they were already there. I mean, they were there and they didn't leave. And they're trying to recruit people from these communities, minority neighborhoods, to be Lutherans. And, I actually find some comfort in that they want them to be part of their community. I don't particularly agree with the brand of belief that they have. They're big on creationism and things like that. I was once debating a school teacher union speaker at a debate on school choice, and they said, in some of those schools, like some of those Lutheran schools, they teach creationism. And I said, well, yeah, that's true, and I don't necessarily agree with the literal creationism as a thing to be taught in school, but the one thing about those Lutheran schools is that most of those kids, when they get out of there, they can spell creation.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's not hurting them. There's pretty good outcomes. You look at the college, the ones who matriculate onto college, it's pretty high.
Yeah. And
it's changing their lives. So, there's worse things in life probably than to be a Lutheran.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think I definitely respect the separation between church and state kind of concept, but I do think that, it's that debate looks different in different settings. We lived in Missoula, Montana for a decade, and it was a largely Caucasian middle class, upper middle class thing, and there was a lot of concern about any sort of overt religious expression in the public schools even from students or their parents or whatever, and we respected that. But when we moved to Los Angeles and put our kids in public school in that area, which was much more racially mixed and high immigrant population and such, people just weren't as concerned about that. They had larger fish to fry, it seemed like, and there was a sense among the principal was much more welcoming to religious folks who were willing to invest in those kids in programs and things, and they didn't care that much if there was a religious aspect to what they were doing.
Okay, now we're going to get to what you like about New Urbanism as a Christian, as a practicing Christian, what you like about New Urbanism. And when when those of us that are active in CNU or part of the New Urbanist movement, we point to things that, it performs better economically, that urbanism, it performs better environmentally, that there are social justice advantages to the connectivity and the ability to walk and all the other things that come with urbanism. Just for example, to explain what I mean there, when you have really strong urbanism like New York City, you could live in Hunts Point in the Bronx, but you can take the 6 train and be in the highest density of jobs in North America in 25 minutes. Take the 6 train down to Wall Street. Well, maybe 40 minutes now that I think about it, because the 6 is the express. But if you switch to anyway, you know where I'm going with that.
Yeah.
But then you go to Detroit, where the urbanism has been degraded. Let's say you lived at 6 Mile Road in Woodward in Detroit, and the downtown has lost a lot of its jobs. And then if you want to go to the suburbs for a job, the suburbs don't like Detroit that much. Some do, but some people in the suburbs do, but there's a sort of bias against it, to the point where the transit system in Detroit doesn't extend beyond the boundaries because the suburbs don't want them to.
Right.
So if you live at 6 Mile Road, you take a bus, which doesn't come very often, and then at the border, you'd have to switch to a suburban bus or to a job broker, somebody with a van who picks people up and takes them to jobs. It's really hard. You're sort of disconnected from the economy. Whereas if you're in an urban place with good transit, so there's a social justice issue there. Mixed-use zoning, multiple housing types, multiple housing price points. Those are all things more likely to happen where you have the complexity of urbanism. So that would fit more with the Christian attitude, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, amen to all those things: social justice and the kind of economic vitality and the benefits that come to the community from that. I think so a lot of my early work was really not adding anything new to the conversation, but just in trying to get the Christian community to read New Urbanists, just on their own terms, and figure out that the false promise that suburbia granted us, in the 50s on, has not delivered, and to hold that dream accountable to what it's given us or not given us.
Speaking of social injustice, when Jesus said that it's harder for a rich man to go through the eye of a camel, I'm mixing metaphors here. Okay. It's harder for a camel to go through the eye of a needle.
Yes. For a rich man to get to heaven.
It's easier for a camel to go through. I'm going to get this right.
You're getting it right.
Easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get through the gates of heaven. Yeah. You could turn that around and say, well, it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than it is for a rich man to get through the gates of a gated community. Well, that's a really badly mixed metaphor. But anyway, the whole idea of gated communities seems so un-Christian.
Yeah. Well, I think where I sort of take that interpretation, it's sort of a funny kind of thing, but I don't, I'm not a socialist, so let's just get that out there. I believe that private property is fine, and for someone with more means to have a larger home, and someone with less means to have a more modest home is probably the way things are going to be. But what New Urbanists have taught me is the value of the public realm, especially.
So you don't want to install the North Korean economic system in the U.S.?
No. So, but the value of the public realm, the public good of a really gracious public realm is so wonderful. And the text that I go to is the gleanings requirement in Leviticus, where when a person who owned a field would harvest their field, they were required to not pick it completely, to leave leave some of the gleanings so that the poor in the community could then follow their harvesters and pick from the remnants and get enough for them to get by on. In a sense, I see the public realm as kind of the gleanings, in a sense that it's the wealthy and the middle class in the community that pay the taxes that allow the public realm to have the gracious things that it does. But then those make life more enjoyable for everybody. I think the problem with the gated
the rich don't suffer. Look at the people who live around Central Park in New York are the richest people on average in North America, if not the world. And they share the park with, you can live in the Bronx like my sister and go to Central Park. You don't have to go through you don't have to have special permission to get in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I think everyone benefits from that. And the problem I have with gated communities, isn't the size of the houses or the ostentatious architecture or such, but that it's really cutting off whatever public amenities might be there from anyone else. That's the real moral issue in my mind. I think that's. But you had asked about the Christian, from a Christian perspective, what's attractive about New Urbanism, and in some ways, I think, the most profound aspect for me is a human honoring environment. One of the things I learned from the Bible is that we were created as embodied creatures, and that was part of what it means for creation to be good, for us to be good. And so we're meant to experience our life in our body, to touch and smell and feel things and encounter people face to face. And so what I love about the New Urbanist recovery of good urbanism is creating places where we can experience the delights of daily life in our bodies. To me, it really honors our bodies, which to me is a really theologically profound truth, that it's not meant to be, we're not meant to experience life 45 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour with a plate of glass between us and not just other people, but our worlds. And it really reduces our humanity when we do so. And I have similar concerns about the attempts to, create community online now. I mean, I think some of that is okay, and a lot of people I've, met who share my passion for these things, I met online. But for me, it's very important that at some point we connect face to face, that it's not solely an online, because I think our bodies are so important to our identity. So that's been a huge, for me, a huge benefit of what the New Urbanists have done for our landscape, is returning us to, environments that respect our bodily life.
And the younger generations are embracing urbanism. Whenever there's new technology and some new ways of living, people are going to have the human tendency to overindulge in the new thing. And I think that's what happened in part with World War II. They had, 12 years of depression and 4 years of war. And then at the end of the war, the buildings, were dirty and needed tuck pointing, and the cities were old and broken down and needed a lot of repair. And so this brave new world in the suburbs that was youth separated and all the, the sort of the American dream as it was enunciated at the time, that had a lot of appeal to my dad's generation, the World War II generation. Yeah. But then the younger people, the younger generations coming along now, they really, I'm sure some of them would like to live in a suburban house with a 3-car garage. Not everybody's the same, but the tendency on balance is for young people to more embrace urban living, and the real estate trends show that, demographic trends show that. We have a guy coming to our meeting in Salt Lake City, Arthur Nelson, who's done he's a professor at the University of Utah, who's done a lot of work on that and shows that, as the boomers downsize, there's really not a market for a lot of the McMansions that they invested in back in the 80s and 90s. Oh, yeah. And the market's changing. It's going urban. So that's where it's going, and the church probably will have to follow.
Absolutely. And I think, one thing that's been part of my growing understanding is I think that's absolutely true. But I love the way that the new urbanist mindset has brought this all to our attention. But I think that it's not only urbanism in the sense of dense, urbanism, but small town or whatever on the transect. I think all that's attractive. People don't all want to live in the dense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Downtown,
if you have a rural hamlet with 200 or 300 people living in it, and the main intersection in town is 8 lanes with a giant turning radii, and everybody's driving 60 miles an hour, that's not going to generate the kind of intimate village environment and public realm that people are going to enjoy. But if you have tight turning radii and just 2 or 4 lanes of traffic, and the buildings are fairly close to the corners, you can actually have a sense of place, a central village for even a very small community.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned the transect. Urbanism can be in any size community, and as the sprawl model can be in really large communities.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Can be just as unpleasant.
Yeah, I've found. I don't know if you've had this experience, but I've had to sometimes translate that for people, because when they hear new urbanism or anything like that, they immediately think of the most dense forms of that, and I have to explain. That we're talking about, non-automobile oriented environments of various scales, basically, and help them see that it could be small town or even rural, so that's, anyway.
So when you, have you given a sermon on this?
I'm old school. I preach, through books of the Bible as kind of we go through.
You text from the Bible.
The text from the Bible, and if I stumble across one that has a real strong urban theme, I might do that. But that hasn't been part of my preaching that much. So I
text from the gospel whenever it's possible.
Exactly.
George Gershwin.
Yeah.
Okay,
but I try to model a respect for urbanism and an understanding of that we are. I love the notion of parish. That's an older sense, but this notion of parish that as a church, we are not just interested in what happens within these walls or on our own property, but we bear some responsibility for the neighborhood as a whole, and that's our.
I'm going to ask you about the architectural layout in heaven, which would be speculation, I suppose, but there is some mention of it in Revelations.
Yeah.
I'm going to get to that in just a minute, but first Tim Halber has a question for you.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, Eric. So my master's thesis in urban planning was on a plaza in San Francisco, and why people didn't want to go there, why people disinvested in this place, why the economy was poor in this neighborhood. Yeah. And it could very well be traced to the public services that were being offered in that neighborhood. There was a concentration of services for the poor in that neighborhood. Yeah. So the plaza would become filled with people needing services. The church, I was raised Catholic, the church does such a good job of offering services in a way that's more humane.
Yeah.
Do you see ways that the church can solve problems such as this, can offer more humane ways to make everyone feel comfortable in public spaces?
Yeah, I think I think certainly, and I think part of the problem that we're experiencing in this country is the part of the suburban mentality of zoning was not just residential and retail separation and separation of styles or scale of residential, but we zoned poverty, to a large extent. And so we really concentrated poverty and concentrated the social services. And I think that, I forget his name, but someone said that poverty does not lead to social problems, but the concentration of poverty leads to social problems. And so, just I think to break down that scale a little bit is part of the solution. Churches can be part of a smaller scale solution. I think when the government agency provides the social services, sometimes, for purposes of scale or for whatever reason, it's done at a large scale, and it can be done in a very impersonal kind of way.
Governments can be very effective at eliminating poverty. I mean, in the United States, thanks to Social Security, abject poverty among the elderly is much, much less likely to happen.
Right.
And most Western European countries have virtually eliminated poverty through transfer payments.
Well, let me
reach that point here.
Yeah.
At one point, Nixon even proposed it, but it
let me maybe go at this from a more personal story. When I went back to graduate school, I left my post in Montana. Basically went without a job and entered a PhD program, and so sort of voluntarily put my family in poverty for a period of time. And so we experienced a little bit of social services on that end. We didn't, we weren't in abject poverty, but we qualified for instance. We didn't do food stamps, but we qualified for the WIC program. So we had young children, so we got coupons that allowed us to get dairy products and things like that, and we would supplement our groceries with that. And I remember going through, the grocery store with these coupons and realized that it may not have been designed this way, but there was a tremendous amount of shame associated with how you procure these products, because there are so many rules based. Like, you could get 1.5 gallons of milk, but you couldn't get 1 gallon and a half gallon. You had to get 3 half gallons. And you couldn't, so what ended up happening inevitably was when you got to the cashier, you would have broken 1 or 2 of those rules, and they would send you back to fix it, So people behind you in line, and everyone's kind of rolling their eyes at you as you're being sent back to get your products right, and everyone's, if you just would have worked harder, whatever. And so I got a little bit of a taste of the degrading nature of how sometimes social services are given. And I think where the church might be able to do a better job, or at least supplement what's being done out there, is to offer social services at a smaller scale, but also in a more humane way, that is not just, giving this thing to an indigent person, but knowing that person's name and their story and doing it with dignity, is I think, in the best case, what the church could offer to that picture.
Yeah, well, in trying to make things better for poor people so they're not poor, that's one of the arguments that I've often made for urbanism. If you have good urbanism, it helps the poor, but then they don't consciously have it right in their face that they're being helped, so they don't feel that chilling touch of patronism that you get with programs where they can be shamed.
Yeah.
City's a better place to live. Another thing, I don't know if it was Saul Alinsky or somebody else who said this, but it was one of the biggest problems poor people have is they don't have enough money. And I think that's where the government, if you look at, Western democracies, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, the United States, that's the one thing that the government can do pretty well, is to change the equation so that the most abject poverty is eliminated. But when you talk about the human experience, the welcoming experience that somebody can get in a church community, and it can transform their life to develop friends, people that support them and through the troubles that everybody has in life.
Right.
That's a really important thing.
Yeah, no, I think in general, that's probably the other thing that attracts me about good urbanism as a Christian, is that sense of seeing people as whole people. I love, the fact that our church is embedded in our neighborhood, and between my church office and my home, it's about a 9-block walk, and on the way, I pass, the pharmacy that we get our prescriptions from. I pass my auto mechanic. We pass the dry cleaners, the bank. All of our services are provided right there. And those people are people that I know for the services they provide, but I also know, I know them as people, because we're neighbors together. They know my public role as a pastor. They also know my private role as a citizen and a neighbor. So I like the fact that we know each other as whole people, not just as sort of abstract service providers or customers. and whatnot. So it's not really just, I mean, that's part of the poverty question and services, but even just in our consuming and the services we need to be able to know people's names and know the names of their kids and all that is I think part of the kind of life we're meant to be living, I think.
It's interesting that the Mormons, and we're having our Congress May 29 through June 1 in Salt Lake City, that the Mormons in Utah, particularly in the Salt Lake metropolitan area, have embraced urbanism. The church itself has been a big supporter of Envision Utah and of expanding the rail transit system. They have the fastest growing rail system in North America. And you're going to be heading up, you're going to be a part of a panel called Frontiers Forged by Faith at the Congress. You want to give a little preview of what that's about?
Yeah, no, that's going to be a really interesting panel. We're going to have a good group of folks from different angles discussing the question of how faith communities have shaped urbanism and shape urbanism today. And it's not necessarily the word frontier there, I think, from what I can tell from some of the people that are on there, is not going to be a historical study per se. It might include some historical.
It's not going to be about Daniel Boone.
No, exactly. It's going to be, frontiers meaning any new directions that are going, even contemporary kinds of things. So I think it'll be really an interesting panel to see, all the different ways that faith communities have shaped urbanism. So, I think
in the subdivisions of, I should say neighborhoods, because they're aiming to be neighborhoods. Like Daybreak is one of the new neighborhoods in the Salt Lake metropolitan area, which has a town center, and it has several Mormon churches in different parts of the developing area.
Yeah.
So the Mormon church has, made it a practice of theirs to have their churches with walk sheds around them, and they've actually, some of them have other churches, even though the biggest single religious affiliation in Utah is Mormons, the Roman Catholic Church and Presbyterian and other churches that are there, some of them in these new developments. So it's sort of addressing it.
Yeah, no, it's really, kind of an interesting example is the Jewish community. There was a big debate in the 60s among the rabbis of the conservative Jewish movement whether it was acceptable to drive on the Sabbath, and they conceded that it was acceptable to drive on the Sabbath, and that allowed the conservative Jewish tradition to make it in the suburbs, or so they thought. So they would, and that allowed them to participate in the full suburban lifestyle that we've all seen. But the Orthodox Jews didn't ever make that concession. And so that's why they've always had to concentrate around the synagogue and have a little bit more of a concentrated Orthodox neighborhoods and such.
Yeah, that's why I was such buddies with Rabbi Tversky on the west side of Milwaukee, which was where the old Jewish neighborhood was. And then,
so it's interesting to see how
the big migration happened with school busing. They started moving out to the suburbs, but the Orthodox stayed behind.
Yeah, no, so that it's interesting to see how that religious commitment had shaped the way they'd done it. But I think of that because I believe, and I'm not entirely sure, I'll ask when we get to Salt Lake, but I believe the Mormon Church has a similar kind of thing where the stake or whatever, the local place where you worship is you're just assigned to go there. You're not church shopping as we're sort of used to in the Protestant tradition. And so that would lend itself better to neighborhood, urban kind of thing, because they would, you would be concerned not only with, your church, but the neighborhood around it, because that's where you live, and it'd be much easier to imagine walking from one to the other and forming.
As monolithic as Mormons might look to outsiders from time to time, they actually have an argument going on right now. The Central Church has been setting design standards for their churches. And even though they're put in neighborhoods, the design is kind of a generic.
Yeah.
Well, not terrible, but it's, a little. It has sort of that drive it look to it a little bit.
Yeah.
So anyway, some of the CNU members that are out there are part of an argument they're having with their church, which I guess it's a friendly argument, but they are arguing about this so that there can be more variety in the church architecture and try to find the best architecture that fits into the type of neighborhood that they're in.
Yeah.
So even the Mormons, they're not quite as monolithic as they look from the outside.
Interesting. I hope that argument continues.
Yeah.
That's cool.
So, all right. So I promised our listeners that we were going to, and you actually, see, I'm a minister's son and a Presbyterian, at least nominally, but my religion is sort of laced with doubt.
Yeah.
Which I find myself comfortable with at this stage in my life, but I talk to my sisters about it.
Yeah.
My wife and I talk. She's a Quaker, so you can imagine the conversations we have.
Yeah.
But you actually believe that there's heaven.
Yeah.
So what does it look like?
Well, I think that's where I kind of got into that a little bit earlier, but I think the popular conception is sort of an ethereal thing where we're all floating around on clouds and playing harps and such. And again, that doesn't seem to correspond to anything I've read in the Bible, but there's a sparse image, so I think there's a lot of room for speculation. I don't usually go there, but the only
I played the French horn. That might
you could play there. Yeah, I think you could.
French horn might work out fine.
My father-in-law used to say the only harpists in heaven are those that play harp now. But the image we have is the new Jerusalem, coming down to renewed earth, and I think even in the evangelical circles, you're seeing a return to this notion of a renewed earth and a new Jerusalem kind of urban picture. So that's coming back, and I think you can. I don't think there's a ton of point of speculating much beyond that, but I think of
there is the allusion to in Revelations the streets of gold.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's
what's your take on that?
Well, I think a lot of the imagery in Revelation, there's a lot of jewel and crystal kind of imagery, and I think what that is John, the writer of Revelation, is been given just an overpowering image, and what those to me are his best way of putting words to just an ineffable beauty that he can hardly describe, and he's grasping at words to describe the beauty. So for me, a lot of that means it's going to be visually stunning and aesthetically wonderful in that sense. I don't necessarily think that one of my friends tried to describe for me a picture of the asphalt truck in heaven, plopping big molten bits of gold to fix the streets and that kind of thing. But I don't necessarily take that with absolute literalism. I think that's just a picture of the beauty. An urban.
You're taking it more of a road contractor's view of what heaven would be like.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not exclusively urban. There's sort of some notion of the trees, with the leaves for the healing of the nations or something sort of confusing like that. But there's some wonderful sort of suggestions of nature in there. So I think they're
Then there's always the notion of, you build your afterlife by what you do while you're on earth. That's not a very Lutheran attitude. The Lutherans would say by faith and faith alone. But if you look in the book of James, it says, faith without good acts or good deeds is death.
Right. Yeah.
So you build
there's some really evocative images in the book of Isaiah, which is in the Old Testament, of the kings of the nations will bring their glories into the gates. And so one of my sort of theological mentors or whatever unpacks that image as saying that there won't be this radical discontinuity between the good things we produce in this life and the next life, but all of the good stuff we accomplish in this life could be conceivably incorporated into what comes next. So I think that's
just in terms of urbanism, there's always the injunction from Nehemiah: build the city.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Nehemiah's a great urban book, and he has a lot of city planning sort of instincts that are good there. So yeah, I think there's and I caution against taking it too far. Sometimes when I was initially in this conversation, there was speculation. What do Christians, what's their particular take on the built environment? Are they going to pull out some secret recipe from the Bible of how they want things to go? And that hasn't been my take, at least. It's been more in a more general sense, having a really firmly rooted doctrine of bodily existence and the goodness of our bodies and the intent that we're supposed to have relationships with one another and that we're meant to thrive and have this kind of shalom experience in our life. That with those impulses, we can enter into the urbanist conversation, not necessarily
not use it as
things.
A trump card.
Yeah, exactly. But just to say, yes, we too want these same. Can we contribute to the effort, not to dominate it and put our own spin on it. We just want to say, yeah, go for it. I think to a lot of extent.
Well, Eric, I really appreciate your thoughts on this, and I'm looking forward to the session you're going to lead in Salt Lake City. And it's a subject that I think can really lead to a lot of understanding, not of everything, not complete understanding, but for a lot of people that might not otherwise be interested in design and good planning and good urbanism, looking at it through the eyes of the religious, I think is something that CNU would do well to practice.
Well, I hope that it will be helpful because I really value what CNU is accomplishing. So thanks for the opportunity to talk about it a little bit.
All right. Well, this is John Norquist, and I'm going to turn it over now to Tim Halber. He's not going to do a benediction. He's just going to sign us off.
Sounds great.
Thanks, everyone, for coming, and do look out for future podcasts. We may be switching formats from this sort of live presentation to a more traditional podcast where you can download an MP3 and listen at your leisure. So do send us feedback if you're interested in that and want to preserve the live aspect, or if you have strong feelings about an MP3-based podcast.
Well, I'm actually looking more for like a television program on Al Jazeera. I know a lot of the people don't want to be on it because it's too controversial. That sounds perfect for CNU.
Great. Okay, thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
All right, thank you. Bye.